his native land home. Two simple words that should have meant everything. But for Darren Lane, standing on the deck of that transport ship as it slipped through the Narrows, those words carried a weight he could not yet understand. A weight that would eventually crush him. A weight that would destroy everything he had left. The ship glided forward, and through the golden haze of sunset, Lane saw her. The Statue of Liberty, black against the burning sky, a symbol of freedom, a welcome to millions. But as he stared at her noble face, something felt wrong. The familiar pang in his chest, the longing, the homesickness, the agony, swelled into something darker, something he couldn't name. The burn of gassed lungs reminded him that he was not the same man who had left this country 2 years ago. He would never be that man again. "My native land," he whispered, and his voice cracked. He wiped at his eyes, but the blur wouldn't clear. Was it only 2 years? It felt like a lifetime. It felt like a century. It felt like he had died in a muddy trench in France and was only now learning to walk among the living. The dead don't come home, but somehow he had, or at least his body had. And yet strangeness, an unsettling strangeness, crept over him. This homecoming, the one he had dreamed of through endless, sleepless nights, the one he had clung to when the shells fell and the gas rolled across no man's land, the one that had kept him alive when death was easier, it was not what he had imagined, not at all. The joy was there, yes, but beneath it, something cold, something waiting, something patient. The vessel glided on. A fresh, cool spring breeze touched his face, carrying the scent of land. For a moment, his eyes closed, and he was back in the orchard behind his mother's house. The blossoms, the damp earth, the smoke from her kitchen fire. He could almost hear her voice calling him in for supper. Almost. But when he opened his eyes, the vision shattered, and he was left staring at a city that seemed to frown at him from across the water. The city didn't welcome him. It judged him. It found him wanting. It had already forgotten him. 100 thoughts fought for dominance in his mind. Memories of the war. Faces of fallen friends. The sound of his own screams in the dark. Men who had died in his arms, gasping their last words, begging him to tell their mothers they loved them. He had promised. He had promised so many times. And now he was going home, and he would have to deliver those messages. He would have to look into the eyes of mothers who had lost their sons and tell them their boys had died bravely. He would have to lie. The city, the magnificent broken skyline of New York, its thousands of windows reflecting the dying fire of the sun like 1,000 accusing eyes. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was not what he had expected. Where were the sirens? Where were the flags? Where were the boats crowded with waving, cheering people? Where was the welcome for the soldiers who had given everything? Lane felt the bitterness rising in his throat, and he swallowed it down. He had hoped he had left that bitterness in the trenches. But no, it had followed him home. It had been waiting for this moment. It had been waiting for him. Someone gripped his arm, a familiar grip. Then the scrape of a crutch on the deck. Lane turned, and there was Blair Maynard, his oldest friend, his brother in arms, standing beside him with a thin white face and eyes full of tears. "Well, Dare, old boy, does it look good to you?" Blair's voice was husky, broken. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much and lost too much. "Yes, Blair, but somehow not just what I expected." "I get you." The Blair Maynard stood as straight as he could with the aid of his crutch. He had lost his leg in the war. He had lost more than that. He had lost his faith, his hope, his belief that anything in this world was worth fighting for. But there was still a hint of pride in the poise of his uncovered head. For a moment, his face softened. The tears spilled over. He didn't wipe them away. "Guess I left my nerve as well as my leg over there," he said. The words hung in the air like a curse, like a confession, like a warning Lane should have heeded. "Blair, it's so good to get back that we're off color," Lane replied. On the level, I could scream like a madman. I'd like to weep. Blair laughed, but there was no humor in it, only pain, only exhaustion. Only a bone, deep weariness that neither of them could ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Anyone who hadn't heard the shells. Anyone who hadn't smelled the gas. Anyone who hadn't held a dying friend in their arms and promised to deliver a message they couldn't deliver. Where's Red? He oughtn't miss this.
Poor devil!
He sneaked off from me somewhere. Red's in pretty bad shape again. The voyage has been hard on him. I hope he'll be well enough to get his discharge when we land. I'll take him home to Middleville. Middleville. The name echoed in Lane's mind like a bell tolling in the distance. Home. His home. Their home. The place where they had been boys together. The place where they had stolen cider and played with the girls and dreamed of the future. The place where everything had once been simple. The place that had sent them off to war with flags and speeches and promises of glory. The place that had forgotten them the moment they left. Blair, does it hit you kind of queer? Lane asked. Do you long yet dread to get home? Blair didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look on his face said everything. It was the look of a man walking toward his own execution. The look of a man who knew he was walking into a trap. The look of a man who had already seen the worst the world had to offer and knew that worse was coming. I've not heard from Helen for over a year, Lane said. The words came out hollow, empty, like he was speaking about someone else. Someone who didn't matter anymore. But she did matter. She mattered more than anything, and that was the problem.
My God, dare!
Blair exploded. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Are you still thinking of her? We are engaged, Lane stammered. At least we weren't. But I've had no word that she, Dare, your childlike faith is due for a jar. Come down to earth. You're a crippled soldier, coming home, and damn lucky at that. Lane felt the words like a physical blow. He had been shot before. He had been hit by shrapnel. He had been gassed. He had watched men die in agony. But this was different. This was a wound that would not bleed, a wound that would not heal, a wound that would fester and grow and consume him from the inside out. Blair, what do you know? That I do not know. For long I've suspected you're wise to things at home. You know I haven't heard much in all these long months. My mother wrote but seldom. Lorna, my kid sister forgot me, I guess. Helen always was a poor correspondent. Dal answered my letters, but she never told me anything about home. When we first got to France, I heard often from Margie Henderson and Mel Iden. Crazy kind of letters, love, sick over soldiers. But nothing for a long time now. At first they wrote. How? Blair's laugh was bitter, harsh like the sound of breaking glass. Short? They wrote love-sick letters. They sent socks and cigarettes and candy and books. And they all wanted us to hurry back to marry them. Then, when the months had gone by and the novelty had worn off, when we went against the hell of real war, sick or worn out, sleepless and miserable, crippled or half-demented with terror and dread and longing for home, then by God, they quit. Oh? No, Blair, not all of them. Lane's voice was weak. He knew it was weak. He hated that it was weak. But he couldn't help it. He needed to believe. He had to believe. Because if he stopped believing, what was left? What was the point of surviving if there was nothing to come home to? What was the point of fighting if nobody remembered? What was the point of anything? Well, old man, I'm sore, and you're about the only guy I can let out on. Blair's voice softened, but only a little. One thing I'm glad of, we'll face it together. Darren, we were kids together. Do you remember? Playing on the commons, straddling the old water, gates over the brooks, stealing cider from the country presses, barefoot boys going to school together. We played post, office with the girls and Indians with the boys. We made puppy love to Dial and Mel and Helen and Margie, all of them. Then, somehow the happy, thoughtless years of youth passed. It seems strange and sudden now, but the war came. We enlisted. We had the same ideal, you and I. We went to France, and you know what we did there together. Now we're on this ship, getting into port of the good old US, good as bad as she is, going home together. Thank God for that. I want to be buried in Woodlawn. Home, home. We feel its meaning. But Dare will have no home, no place. We are old. We are through. We have served. We are done. What we dreamed of as glory will be cold ashes to our lips, bitter as gall. You always were a dreamer, an idealist, a believer in God, truth, hope and womanhood. In spite of the war, these somehow survive in you. But Dare, old friend, steel yourself now against disappointment and disillusion. The words hit Lane like a bullet to the chest. He felt his heart stop for just a moment. Then it started again, pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. Blair knew something. Something he wasn't saying. Something he was afraid to say. And that something was going to destroy Lane. He opened his mouth to ask, to demand, to beg. But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped in his throat, choked by the fear that had been growing in his chest since the moment he saw the Statue of Liberty. The fear that everything was different. The fear that nothing would ever be the same. The fear that the beast was waiting. Used as Lane was to his comrades' outbursts, this one struck him like a blow to the soul. The chill of his earlier misgiving returned stronger now, augmented by a strange uneasiness, a premonition. Something was waiting for him. Something dreadful. Something that would destroy everything he had left. Something that would take away the last shred of hope he was clinging to. But he threw it off. He forced himself to believe. Faith would not die in Lane. It could not die utterly because of what he felt in himself. Yet, what was in store for him? Why was his hope so unquenchable? There could be no resurgam for Darren Lane. Resignation should have brought him peace. Peace when every nerve in his shell, shocked body racked him. Peace when he could not subdue a mounting hope that all would be well at home. Peace when he quivered at thought of mother, sister, sweetheart. But peace was not coming. Peace was a lie. The ship glided on under the shadow of America's emblem. The bronze woman holding out her light to the world, the symbol of hope to millions. But for Darren Lane, she was a silent witness to his torment. He held to his maimed comrade while they stood bare, headed and erect, passing the statue. Lane knew what Blair felt, but nothing of what that feeling was could ever be spoken. It was too deep, too dark, too private. The deck was crowded with passengers, but they were dead to anything more than a safe arrival. They were not crippled American soldiers. Except these two, there were none in service uniforms. The city loomed, its many-eyed buildings watching, judging. The low roar of traffic came on the breeze. The passengers and crew were glad to dock before dark. They took no notice of the rigid, erect soldiers. They didn't see them. They didn't want to see them. They were an inconvenience, a reminder of something they had tried to forget, a ghost of a war they wanted to pretend had never happened. Lane, arm in arm with Blair, face to the front, stood absorbed in a sense of nameless sublimity. The spirit of freedom burned as a white flame in his heart. But it was not that spirit which held them erect, aloof, proud. It was a supreme consciousness of immeasurable sacrifice. A sacrifice that had been made for others. A sacrifice that had never been asked for. A sacrifice that had never been appreciated. They had sustained immense loss of health and happiness. The future seemed like the grey, cold, gloomy expanse of the river, and there could never be any reward except this white fire of their souls. Nameless, but it was the increasing purpose that ran through the ages. Or so they had been told. The ship docked at dark. Lane left Blair at the rail, gloomily gazing down at the confusion and bustle on the wharf. Men were shouting. Cranes were creaking. Wagons were rumbling. The city was alive with commerce and energy. But none of it was for them. None of it was for the soldiers. Lane went below to search for their comrade, Red Payson. He found him in his stateroom, half crouched on the berth, oblivious to the important moment. The boy, for he was barely more than a boy, was curled into himself, his eyes closed, his breath shallow. He looked like he was already dead, like he had died in France and nobody had told him. It required a little effort to rouse Payson. He was a slight boy, not over 22, sallow-faced and freckled, with hair that gave him the only name his comrades knew him by. The war had aged him beyond his years. There were deep shadows under his eyes, and his hands trembled constantly. The men called it shell shock. The doctors called it war neurosis. Red called it something else. He called it the beast. Lane packed the boy's few possessions and talked vehemently all the time. He talked about home. He talked about the good food, the soft beds, the smiling faces. He talked about everything he hoped was waiting for them. He didn't believe a word of it, but he kept talking. Because if he stopped talking, he would have to think. And if he thought, he would have to feel. And if he felt, he would break. Red braced up, ready to go. He had little to say, and that with the weary nonchalance habitual with him. He had learned not to hope. Hope was a luxury for men who hadn't seen what he had seen. Hope was a poison that killed you slowly, day by day. As each expectation was crushed and each dream was shattered, Red had stopped hoping a long time ago. And it had kept him alive. Lane helped him up on deck. The exertion, slight as it was, brought home to Lane that he needed help himself. His lungs burned. His legs trembled. His head swam. The doctors had told him he would recover. They had lied. He knew that now. He would never recover. He would never be the man he had been. That man had died in France. What was left was only a shadow. They found Maynard waiting where they had left him. He was still at the rail, still staring at the city, still lost in his own thoughts. The three soldiers stood together on the deck of the docked ship, watching the chaos of the city that had forgotten them. Passengers streamed past them. Families reunited, lovers embraced. Children ran to their fathers. And nobody looked at the soldiers. Nobody saw them. Nobody cared. The city buzzed with life, with music, with laughter, with a wild, reckless energy that made no sense to men who had just returned from hell. They had left a world of death and destruction. They had returned to a world of dancing and drinking and forgetting. A world that had moved on without them. A world that had decided the war was over and it was time to celebrate. Lane watched a group of young women walk past, their dresses short, their hair bobbed, their laughter carefree. They didn't look at him. They didn't see his uniform. They didn't notice the scars on his face or the emptiness in his eyes. They saw nothing. They wanted to see nothing. The war was over. The boys were home, and nobody cared. The war was over. The boys were home, and nobody cared. For Darren Lane, the homecoming he had dreamed of for so long was about to become a nightmare far worse than anything he had faced on the battlefields of France. The war had ended, but a new battle was about to begin. A battle for his soul, a battle for his sanity, a battle for everything he had once believed in. The beast was waiting, and it was hungry. The city was not welcoming him home. It was devouring him, and he didn't even know it yet. Lane stood on the dock, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and looked around at the faces of the people rushing past. They were happy. They were carefree. They were alive. And they looked right through him like he was a ghost. Because in a way, he was. He had died in that trench in France. He had left his soul in the mud. What was coming home was only the shell. The man who had left was gone. The man who had believed in God and truth and hope and womanhood was dead. What remained was a hollow thing that still breathed and ate and walked. But it wasn't alive. Not really. The beast was waiting, and it was hungry. Welcome home, soldier. Welcome to hell. Lane thought about the letters. The ones he had written to Helen from the trenches. The ones he had poured his heart into, telling her he loved her, telling her he would come home to her, telling her they would build a life together. He had written hundreds of letters. She had written back. In the beginning. Then her letters had grown shorter, less frequent. Then they had stopped altogether. He thought about the silence. The terrible silence that had stretched for months. The silence that had followed him across the ocean. The silence that was waiting for him now. Blair knew something. Lane was certain of it. And whatever it was going to destroy him. But Lane was a survivor. He had survived the war. He had survived the gas. He had survived the shrapnel. He had survived the shelling. He had survived when better men had died. He had survived when the doctors had given him no hope. He had survived when he had given himself no hope. And he would survive this too. Whatever it was. Whatever waited for him at home. Whatever the beast was. Or so he told himself. But deep down in the darkest part of his soul, he knew the truth. He had survived the war. But he might not survive the peace. The beast was waiting, and it was hungry. And it had been waiting for Darren Lane for a very long time.